Okay, everybody. Welcome. We're going to talk about a few things today. I looked over the Watson book again just to think about the exam that's coming on Friday, and it occurred to me that doing the Panic of 1837 doesn't make a lot of sense because he mentions the Panic of 1837 in chapter 8 and 9, but he doesn't really explain it until chapter 12, which we've not yet read. So, and he explains it badly. But that doesn't matter. One of the questions is likely to be something about the Panic of 1819, his interpretation of it versus my interpretation. Another would be the difference between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. What accounts for the difference between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans? For Watson, it's more of a kind of philosophical thing, as you'll see in the midterm. He sees it as more basically a philosophical difference. For me, it's really the issue is the Bank of the United States. Is the Bank of the United States a machine for the corruption of the government, as Jefferson calls it, and to me, the Democratic Republicans form expressly to stop the first Bank of the United States. That's not Watson's view. Watson's view is that there are these deeper philosophical differences about the market revolution and things like that that are important. Not the market revolution, but sort of international, basically the economy, an agricultural economy versus an industrial economy. So that's Watson's take on this, and you can compare that to my take. And again, this is the shirt here I'm wearing today is to suggest that you should make history. I know this is a Nike shirt, and it's supposed to be about being a sports ball star or something like that. And what I want to suggest is that your job in this class is to make history, not to listen to me and repeat what I say verbatim, nor to read the Watson textbook and repeat what Watson says verbatim, but to make the history yourself, to sort of compare those two and give your own account of what happened, who's right, compare them and make a decision, make the history yourself. So apologies for the goofy. Nelson versus Watson again. And then a third one might be, a good one might be about reform, and that's what we're going to talk about today, is where kind of abolitionist reform comes from and what it has to do with religion. And as we'll see, Watson's got a take on this, and I've got a take on this, and I want to give you my take on this today. All right. First, a little bit of background. To plug this into the rest of the semester, one of the interesting ironies about the South is that many of the most prominent Southerners are political leaders and lawyers, and the route to power and privilege for them is largely through the state. Men like John C. Calhoun, for example, opposed national power, but were firmly wedded to state power. They don't really believe in laissez-faire or free trade. They just believe in state power over state resources. And so Calhoun is the person behind the idea that abolitionist mail should be inspected by postmasters and then destroyed. The Southern enslavers in politics hope that state sovereignty will stifle interstate railroad systems and the isms that it brings: corruptionism, gambling, the loose morals of the exchange, abolitionism. They see these things as all linked together. Weird. So someone like John C. Calhoun can stop those things in the South, but not in the North. And he sees the rising power of railroad lobbyists. In another environment, Calhoun might be a kind of political reformer, someone who's trying to bring about change in the sort of political landscape to minimize the power of businesses and things like that. But primarily, Calhoun is interested in defending slavery. And he fears that federal power to control, federal power through railroad lobbyists and others might be used against slavery. To reiterate, there's a question, 2 questions on the explanation of both panics are fair game. No, one of the questions will be about the Panic of 1819. Likely one of them will be about the difference between Federalists and Democrats, and the third one will be about the kind of source of abolitionism. 1837 isn't good because Watson doesn't explain it until chapter 12. Okay, so I just want to get that out of the way as a kind of intro to what I want to talk about today, which is the Second Great Awakening and its relationship to anti-slavery. All right, first of all, in Europe we see it's connected with vaguely something called the Enlightenment, but I'd argue that there's this growing secularism from around 1600 to around 1720, a kind of belief in human power over the elements. It's very important, a kind of distrust of explanations that rely on God. In part, this is taking place in the context of bitter fights between Protestants and Catholics. And so what we see over this period from 1600 to 1720 is a growth of secularism, an increasing attempt to define diseases, for example, not as God's will, but as connected to particular kinds of environments and things like that, attempts to generally a sense that human power over the world is increasing. And you can see this here with this image, which shows distillation, which shows manufacturing, which shows cannons and these sorts of things, the sort of many kind of human achievements that are a part of this growth of secularism, which is connected with, and secularism means a kind of belief that God does not explain everything about the world. Okay, so in the American history timeline, then we've got, first of all, what's called the First Great Awakening, which happens before the Revolution, from 1720 to 1760. And one of the things that's most associated with is the decline of deference. That is the belief that there is a natural order in which there are betters and peasants or plebeians. This idea that anyone should be in a position to vote, for example, which was quite radical compared to Europe. Even places, there were relatively few places where you could vote in Europe, and those places, the people who had the capacity to vote were landowners only. And so we see a decline of deference and a kind of commitment to broadly a sort of democracy. And then in the period of the Revolution, we see a decline in religion in what's called deism. And that's associated, for example, with Jefferson's Bible, which you see down here. Thomas Jefferson took the Bible, and all the supernatural explanations for events that he saw, he cut them out of the Bible. And had his Bible that had things like do unto others as you wish you would do unto you, or the story of the story of Christ's relationship with people, but any supernatural stories, turning one loaf into 1,000 loaves, or one fish into 1,000 fishes, or turning water into wine, you just cut those out. So, not believing that supernatural explanations of things were. Tom Paine's Age of Reason is another one, and Tom Paine is much more explicit about this idea that you don't need God to explain anything in the universe, really. Okay, and after this then comes the Second Great Awakening. Now these timelines are a little bit fuzzy, and you'll see Second Great Awakening defined as slightly different period, but it's pretty clear that the Second Great Awakening follows the Revolution, starts around 1801, and it's different in the North and the South. Now, Watson says this, but I think that it's important to understand that, and in the North it's associated with the middle class, it's associated with women, and it's associated with political reform. He talks about the South, but I think he doesn't talk very much about the Black South and the way in which the Second Great Awakening changes the South among enslaved people and free blacks. And that's a religion that I would argue is syncretic. That is, it blends North African, Yoruba, and Igbo traditions with Christianity. It relies on Bible scraps, tiny bits of the Bible, which are then repeated in sermons. And it's much more radical. It relies on some of the more interesting parts of the Bible, the story of Noah, the story of my brain today. Goodness. The other radicals in the Bible besides Noah. The plagues. Moses. My brain today. Moses, Noah, Samson. Those are the three heroes of the Old Testament, all of whom are kind of radicals. And so Moses and Samson and Noah, thank you. Yeah, I've been on the phone with lots of newspaper people, and so yes, so those radicals, and then for the White South, an emphasis on the New Testament, the Old Testament, in particular, authority and honoring thy father, and an attempt to take parts of the Bible that don't have a lot of radicals in them and make those part of the sort of biblical tradition that you rely on. But one similarity is that that Moses is adopted in one way by African Americans, who is the kind of radical who sees the world changing and brings plagues that are visited upon people, that Moses says, let my people go. Whereas for white Southerners, it's more the kind of the power of the father figure in Moses, the relationship between him and his brothers, the notion that one should obey these leaders. Okay, so what's happening in the North? If we think about the way in which work is structured, and we're going to get to reform here in a minute, but the work is changing in the North. The traditional organization of most industries in the US, and those are mostly in cities, is this organization, which is artisan, journeyman, apprentice. You can see the apprentices here on the left. They're the boys. You can see the journeyman in the middle, and you can kind of between them, the one who's fixing just about to cut apart the wheel, and then the one in the center is the artisan. And so there's this idea of ranks that you go up, initially learning the craft as a young boy. Often apprentices would be kind of sold off to an artisan who would use them for labor, but give them some of the basics. A journeyman would be someone who had those skills, was paid a portion of the take from the artisan. In general, the boys, and this is very much a male thing, the boys would just get a penny a day or something like that, or a nickel every week. The journeyman, though, got a portion of the proceeds from the artisan. And then, after making a masterpiece, a masterwork, one could promote oneself to artisan, go off on one's own with those skills. So that tradition is one that's actually still, it's not gone. If you go to the shipyards today in Newport News or New Orleans, the way in which you do most of those jobs is through this apprenticeship system. You become an apprentice. It's a little more formalized. There's more training and stuff like that. But this apprenticeship system still exists. It's a medieval system. It goes back to the Middle Ages. But it still exists. And it's actually very strong in Germany, for example. This is partly why Germany is such a great industrial power, is that they have a very strong apprenticeship system. But that system starts to break down in the United States in the 1840s and 50s, partly with mechanization. And with mechanization, what we see are one artisan, one person who is, the kind of, who's called a master, and a whole bunch of people who are never going to own a shop of their own. So this is a clock factory, and as you can see, there are way too many apprentices here for these people to create their own clock factories. And the clock factory requires a certain amount of machinery. It requires having access to water that can turn the lathe, that can turn the various instruments. It requires being able to buy these sources. And so you can see that there are 4 guys with top hats, one on the left, and 3 guys, one on the left, and the other 2 on the right with top hats, and those are the capitalists in this system. And they are something like masters of their craft, but they employ 50 to 60 apprentices and as workers, and these workers will never own a shop of their own. Okay, so this is connected with a growing use of capital in construction of various kinds. A shoe factory is one of the ones that's most hierarchical. Instead of making shoes individually, like my great-grandfather did, people break that process up into multiple parts. So one person makes the sole, another person makes the stitches, the side of the, one person cuts the leather, another person stitches it to the sole, a third person puts the holes in the leather and kind of creates the shoe, and you break it up into multiple parts. And again, in this environment, there's one sort of master artisan, probably somebody who had learned the trade as an apprentice, but the kind of factory that he's going to set up is going to require 50 to 100 workers, and this is not, those 50 to 100 workers are most of them are never going to become people who own their own factories. Nail factories, the same way, it's broken up into pieces. Now this is not everywhere. It's primarily in places like New York City and Philadelphia and Boston. To a certain extent, it's areas along the Erie Canal, like Rochester. And so, we shouldn't think that the North is primarily industrial at this point. But the places where it is industrial, that industry is changing. Well, what does that mean? One of the things that happens in a place like Rochester then is increasingly the sort of traditional system of organization. The journeymen and the apprentices would live in the house of the master artisan, right? They would eat dinner with the master artisan. They would learn the craft in this older tradition. In this newer tradition, these are mostly immigrants who are doing this kind of grunt work that's involved in this new industry. And the immigrants that you see in the 1840s in New York are mostly Irish Catholics, people who have escaped the potato famine, or they're Francophone, people from Quebec who are French Canadians who come south. These immigrants have very different traditions than the traditions of the master artisans and others. They're Christians, but they're not. But they're Catholics, many of them, and not Protestants. And so, connected with the reform movement, a religious reform movement of the Second Great Awakening, then we see an increasing interest in what it is that's happening inside the houses of Irish Catholics. And one of the fears on the part of Protestants is that Irish Catholics are drinking too much. And so temperance becomes one of the issues for temperance is basically restricting the use of alcohol, ideally not drinking it at all, and closing bars and closing grog shops and places like that sell alcohol. And alcoholism is a serious problem. It is true in the 1830s and 1840s. It is true that many people die of alcohol poisoning. It's true that excessive consumption of alcohol shortens people's lives, but it's also true that the sort of Second Great Awakening folks, mostly Methodists and Methodists and Episcopalians, to a certain extent, Northern Baptists, are interested in intervening in families that are Irish Catholic families or Francophone Catholic families that they feel are somehow dysfunctional. That these absent fathers, these drinking fathers, are beating their children. The children are growing up incorrectly. So they create orphanages, and there is a real problem with orphans in the 1830s and 1840s. So these people are trying to change things. They're seeing the results of this something like an industrialization that's happening, and connected with this, we're seeing sort of families that are fracturing apart. But at the same time, there's a sort of Methodist impulse or Protestant impulse to kind of fix Catholic families, if that makes sense. So they're do-gooders, but they're also interferers, the people who are likely to interfere in the work of others. So that reform, often led by women, provides opportunity for women to kind of visit families. They fund orphanages. They organize temperance. So I don't want to suggest that these are bad things at all, but there is a kind of a sense that we're doing it right and you're doing it wrong, if that makes sense, right? That we've got it all figured out and you don't. If you've ever played the game Civilization, you know that shortly after you get battleships, you get ministers, right? And so once you have the battleships, then the ministers come. And this kind of ministering is I don't want to dismiss it. I don't want to suggest that it's a bad thing. They are trying to kind of deal with serious problems, but they're also trying to evangelize. They're also trying to convert people. Okay. In the South, what we see is a new kind of religious merging of the Protestant and particularly Methodist and Baptist traditions with a longer and older African religious tradition, particularly connected with burial and marriage and the birth of children. There are events that take place in Igbo and Yoruba societies that are kind of blended with African traditions. And I want to play you a song, The New Burying Ground, and when this thing ultimately goes to YouTube, probably copyright is going to sweep in. You won't be able to hear it. So. Oops. Come on, let's go to burying over in the new burying ground. These songs, sorrow songs, this is a burying song, are sung and they're described by people who watch them in kind of visitors and others as being off key as they see it. Everything is too muted, everything is in a kind of a tempo that's confusing, and there's all these phrases that float up. Hammer keeps ringing on somebody's coffin over in the new burying ground. These phrases are kind of floating phrases that are an important part of this Black spiritual tradition that is connected in part with a new kind of sermon that emerges in the Second Great Awakening. It's illegal and dangerous to be involved in a church that has only enslaved people in it. But there are many of these kind of churches, informal churches, that sprout up in plantations in the South, particularly large plantations, Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia. In particular, not so much in Virginia. And these Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia religious meetings are in secret. They take little scraps of the Bible. The minister will repeat the scrap of the Bible, and other people will shout it back to him in what's called call and response, or syncopation, where and gradually the sermon builds up to a conclusion in which people faint and shout. It's a very distinctive tradition. It's associated with the Second Great Awakening, but the African version of it in the South is very different. Now, this religious tradition moves up across the Ohio River to places where free people, formerly enslaved people, kind of escape. And so there's a great many escapes across the Ohio River into southern Illinois and southern Indiana and southern Ohio. Where we see AME, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and others form. And some of these churches try to stem the African traditions that they see among Southerners who come north. They say that these African traditions are barbaric. This is the churches themselves. They try to sort of take into account some of these traditions, including things like putting the minister on what's something like a throne, but others they reject. So, but you see a lot of churches emerge in this period, very much connected with song and very different. Okay, back to northern evangelicals. You saw in the book about Charles G. Finney, who in a place like Rochester in upstate New York is converting people in large numbers, many to Methodist and Baptist churches, many of them workers, many of them former Catholics who are becoming Protestants, others who grew up in Protestant families but come to the church under Finney. Finney's greatest, pupil is Theodore Weld. And Theodore Weld is an evangelist, but also someone who believes that slavery is wrong. He goes to Lane Seminary in 1831 as a student, and his plan is to kind of burrow into Lane Seminary and break it apart along northern and southern lines on the question of slavery. He arrives at a really important time. The thing that benefits him most, bear with me for a second. In the 1833 and 1834 session, Theodore Weld arrives, and a cholera epidemic strikes in the Lane Seminary. And Lane Seminary is a place that's supposed to train people to be ministers. Theodore Weld is a little bit sort of traveling incognito. He's already a minister of the gospel, but he pretends to be a student. When the cholera epidemic strikes, all the students are confined to their dorm, and Weld ministers to these people. The other thing that Weld does is he travels to black churches and helps to set up organizations that are designed to teach in Sunday school black families who have left slavery, who've not been allowed to learn how to read and write. And so he watches and sees many of these black ceremonies that take place. Yes. Well, question is any relationship to Harriet Beecher Stowe? Yes. So Lyman Beecher is Harriet Beecher Stowe's dad. Calvin Stowe will become her husband. There's an Underground Railroad that is, overhyped. Every town in the North claims to have been part of the Underground Railroad. You can see there's way too many historic sites for Underground Railroads than there were actually Underground Railroad stations. But an important site for the Underground Railroad was, in fact, Cincinnati, where the Lane Seminary was. And many enslaved people crossed the Ohio River to get to Ohio, and then eventually go to Canada, where it's even safer to be a black person, and you're less likely to be returned if you move over to Canada. Okay. Weld convinces a friend, William Allen, an heir to a large slave estate, that slavery is wrong. He begins to talk to others about immediate emancipation, which you saw in the book. Immediate emancipation, the idea that slavery is not just an ill, but it needs to be stopped right away. By February of 1834, after the cholera epidemic is over, he and the other members of the student members create an organization that is designed to debate things on campus. And what they decide to debate is whether slavery is godly and whether the American Colonization Society is unchristian. Now remember, the American Colonization Society is an organization that's designed to send black people back to Africa. And people who are immediate emancipationists believe that this is wrong, that sending people back to Africa is not a solution to the problem of slavery. The solution to the problem of slavery is emancipation, immediate emancipation. And so this group gets together of mostly students, of entirely students, and they begin to tell their stories. Half of them are from the North, half from the South. They're all white men. But William Allen and many others describe in detail something that many Northern men don't know anything about, which is precisely how slavery works. How people get sold down the river, how families are separated, the abuses that take place inside the plantation. The idea that many Northerners have is that the plantation is a place where many black people are happy, where the minstrel shows are white people dressed in blackface, dancing and singing and eating watermelon, and all these other stereotypes about happy black people. And what happens in this meeting group is many people hear shocking stories about the horrors of slavery. Some of these men who are converted by Theodore Weld to immediate emancipation refuse to come to the South, refuse the inheritance they get. They were expected to get from their fathers. They refuse to engage or be connected to slavery at all. As you can imagine, this is a Methodist organization. It's designed to keep people in the church. It's designed to avoid the question of slavery at all costs. And what Theodore Weld has done is to mess all that up. Now, he's not the only one that's messing all that up. Another group that's messing all that up is the Huntington family. And the Huntington family are a group of Northern... is it the Huntington family? Yes. And the Huntington family is a group of Northern brothers and sisters. They start out at 2 or 3 of them, and then cousins join in and things like that. And they travel around the North singing these songs that they've learned from enslaved people in Ohio. They create what we would call folk music, including... Oh, sorry, it's not Huntington, it's Hutchinson family. I thought I had something wrong. Hutchinson family. So they start in the 1840s and 1850s. They learn these songs. This is the Hutchinson family at their peak in the middle of the 1850s. And this is the first kind of large-scale kind of musical stardom that starts in the United States. The Hutchinson family are very popular. Their songs are very popular. And I'll very briefly start you a song so you can hear what it sounds like. Oh, come on. I'm going to have to sing it? All right. Ho, the car emancipation, ride majestic through our nation, bearing on its train the story, liberty and nation's glory. Roll it along, roll it along, roll it along through the nation, freedom's car emancipation. Sorry. It's been a very long time since I've been in chorus. That's the tune. People are attracted to this music. They travel from town to town. They hear people singing in a kind of open court, and then they bring them out to these revival meetings. But these revival meetings that the Hutchinson family are organizing are very different from Second Great Awakening of our revival meetings, because they're revival meetings about ending slavery. And the Hutchinson family gets chased out of many towns when it's clear that the kind of revivalism that they're preaching with their music, with these songs that they have kind of borrowed cadence, borrowed tunes, borrowed some of the phrases of African American songs from the South to condemn slavery. They become very popular. This song, "Roll It Along," is one of Bob Dylan's favorite songs and becomes a basis for a number of his own songs. The sort of taking of these sort of folk traditional songs and then turning them into your own songs is something that Bob Dylan did in the 1960s, but the Hutchinson family did in the 1840s and 1850s. All right, well, what does this say about where evangelical reform comes from? Well, in the Watson book, you see evangelical reform comes from people like William Lloyd Garrison, and he mentions occasional black abolitionists who travel. But to me, what's interesting about this reform tradition and different about this reform tradition is that it blends black criticisms and the sort of cultural traditions of a kind of enlivened black church with the kind of evangelical moral reform organizations that exist in the North. The people who do that, like the Hutchinson family, like Theodore Weld, are not distinctly drawing on only white traditions of moral reform and uplift. They're also blending with them these traditions and these stories about the horrors of slavery. Sitting in the audience at this debate about the horrors of slavery at the Lane Seminary in Cincinnati is Calvin Stowe's daughter, Lyman Beecher's daughter, Harriet Beecher. Harriet Beecher hears as a young woman these stories that shock her in 1834 about what slavery is and what it's like to escape from slavery, what it's like to watch slavery grind people down, split people apart, the horrors of slavery. In 1834, by 1835 and 1836, Calvin Beecher shuts this organization down. He and Calvin Stowe and Baxter Dickinson collectively say this is unacceptable for the Lane Seminary. At that point, it's not 34, it's not 35, it's 34. In 1834, in the spring of 1834, 30 of the students, 30 of the 60 students at the Lane Seminary all leave. They leave Lane Seminary. They say the reason for Lane Seminary was for us to freely debate our relationship to God, to freely debate all questions. We were taught by you to consider all questions. And now you're telling us that we can't talk about slavery because it's too divisive, because it's going to split us apart. And so these 30 people, or students, go off to form Oberlin College. after this, which is the first abolitionist university. They bring with them Theodore Weld, who becomes one of its first instructors. There are a bunch of things that are interesting about this. They're the first vegetarians in the 1850s. They're kind of, the Oberlin College is, and they don't allow women to matriculate in Oberlin College, but they do allow them to attend classes. This is this is unique, really, in this university system. But back to Harriet. Harriet watches this. She watches Lane Seminary fall apart as her father and the man who would be her husband go on to disassemble and break Lane Seminary apart. She does not break with her husband. She does not, she marries him 2 years later. She becomes Harriet Beecher Stowe. She has 4 children. And it's only in 1850, 16 years later, where am I? When the Fugitive Slave Act is passed in 1850, which declares that posses can be created in the North to bring slaves back to the South. This becomes national legislation. It's supported by Henry Clay, who you see here in the center. It's called the Great Compromise of 1850, but it allows fugitive slave catchers to travel anywhere in the North, grab black people, and bring them to the South, and for the states to pay for the recapture and return of enslaved people. She is so angry about this compromise of 1850 that she sits down and writes a novel about her experiences. And what she recalls is those events that she heard in 1834. There were many people who had stories to tell about slavery, but most abolitionists didn't know slavery very well. Harriet Beecher did. Harriet Beecher remembered those stories that she had heard in Lane Seminary by people who had grown up in the system of slavery. And she turned those stories into a kind of romantic novel that we call Uncle Tom's Cabin. Uncle Tom's Cabin, released in 1850, becomes written initially in 52, initially published in a series of short stories that are kind of bound together. And it becomes a sensation. It becomes the most read book in the 1850s. It's patterned in part on the cheap dime novels that we talked about before, like the awful disclosures of Maria Monk. Remember that Maria Monk, you could just see from the picture in the front, how much this borrows from these stories about Catholic atrocities and broken families and things like that. She describes a man named Uncle Tom who, Little Eva, he creates these characters who are kind of composite characters of people that she knows about and is familiar with. And she tells it in this sort of page-turning way that was very, very popular in dime novels, and it makes it almost impossible to read now. The stereotypes in Uncle Tom's Cabin are really, really hard to read now, but they're really designed in part to reach a popular audience, not an upper-class audience, not a middle-class audience, but a working-class audience. The people who read dime novels. And that's why it has this kind of cliche-ridden romantic story. It's like reading Twilight. You just, every page you feel like your life is shortening. So it's that sort of it's that sort of writing that's very popular, very cheap, but compelling about the horrors of slavery. So how does the Second Great Awakening become in the North, become a kind of anti-slavery movement? The story that we get from Watson is that this is primarily Northern moral reformers who decide that slavery is something that needs to be opposed. They're joined by the occasional black abolitionist like Frederick Douglass. I want to suggest that the most important Second Great Awakening figures, like Theodore Weld, like Harriet Beecher Stowe, like the Hutchinson family, know intimately about what's happening in the South. They take, in some ways, the stories, the horror stories of the South, and turn them into song and turn them into popular novels. And these are going to be the things that is going to shake apart the second party system, which has been designed to prevent any discussion of slavery. This popular movement, written in part by women, in part by outsiders like the Hutchinsons, outsiders like Theodore Weld, are going to so shake up the political system that the second party system is going to collapse by 1852 and 1853. We'll talk about that after the exam. Yeah. Holy smokes, I did it. Questions? Also about the exam. One of them would be the kind of sources of moral reform. The format is the same as the previous ones. There will probably be 3 questions, and we look forward to seeing them. Thanks so much, and see you guys again on Monday. I'll be here on Friday, and I'll be very, very briefly on Twitch, just to sort of, start so I can answer any questions when you see the exam. And again, you have 24 hours to do it. So thanks again.